Welcome back, and tonight we travel gently into the kitchens, dining rooms, and breakfast tables of Victorian Britain, as the world outside filled with steam trains, factory whistles, and growing cities. Ordinary people still began each day with something much more familiar. They thought about breakfast. The Victorian era lasted from 1837 to 1901, during the reign of Queen Victoria, and food played an important role in daily life. What people ate depended greatly on where they lived, how much money they earned, and what foods were available in their local markets. Yet, despite these differences, meals provided rhythm and comfort in a rapidly changing world. Imagine a quiet morning in London in the middle of the 19th century. The streets are still damp from overnight rain. Coal fires are being lit across the city. In countless homes, breakfast is already being prepared. For wealthy families, the morning meal could be remarkably large. A Victorian gentleman might sit down to eggs, bacon, sausages, kidneys, toast, butter, jam, and several cups of tea. Some households also served fish, cold meats, or porridge. Breakfast was considered the most substantial meal of the day because many believed it provided strength and energy for work and social obligations. In grand houses, servants rose before dawn to prepare these elaborate spreads. The smell of baking bread and sizzling bacon drifted through hallways long before the family appeared. Middle-class families enjoyed a somewhat simpler breakfast, though still more generous than what many people eat today. Bread and butter were common, often accompanied by porridge, eggs, or leftover meat from the previous evening's dinner. Tea had become an essential part of British life and appeared on nearly every breakfast table. By the middle of the Victorian era, tea was affordable enough to be enjoyed by much of the population. A warm cup of tea offered comfort during cold mornings and became deeply woven into daily routines. For working-class families, breakfast was often much plainer. Many laborers began work early and needed something filling but inexpensive. Bread was the foundation of countless meals. A thick slice spread with dripping, which was rendered animal fat, provided calories for long hours of physical labor. Porridge made from oats was another popular choice because it was cheap, nutritious, and easy to prepare. In industrial cities, some workers purchased hot food from street vendors on their way to factories. These simple meals were designed not for luxury, but for survival. Yet even modest breakfasts carried a sense of routine and familiarity. Across Victorian Britain, from elegant townhouses to crowded tenements, the first meal of the day marked the beginning of another ordinary chapter in 19th century life. As the morning slowly faded into afternoon, Victorian families began thinking about the next meal of the day. Unlike modern schedules, eating times varied depending on class and occupation. For factory workers and laborers, a midday meal needed to be practical and quick. Many carried food from home, wrapped in cloth or paper. A common lunch might consist of bread, cheese, cold meat if it was affordable, and perhaps an apple or onion. These simple foods could survive several hours without refrigeration and provided enough energy to continue working through long shifts. In the growing industrial cities, workers often had little time to eat. Factory bells regulated daily life, and meal breaks were brief. Some people purchased hot pies from street vendors. Others visited small eating houses, where inexpensive stews and soups were served. The smell of baking pastry and simmering broth drifted through crowded streets, attracting customers looking for a warm meal during a busy day. For middle-class families, luncheon was often a lighter affair. Housewives might serve cold meats, bread, rolls, salads, fish, or leftover dishes from previous meals. Victorian kitchens were careful places where very little food was wasted. Leftovers were transformed into entirely new dishes. Cold roast beef could appear in sandwiches. Extra vegetables might become soup. Resourcefulness was considered a virtue, and skilled cooks knew how to stretch ingredients without sacrificing flavor. Wealthier households enjoyed a more leisurely midday experience. Luncheon could include several courses served in elegant dining rooms. Guests might be offered cold chicken, ham, game birds, pastries, fruits, and various desserts. Fresh produce became increasingly available thanks to improved transportation networks. Railways allowed food to travel greater distances than ever before, bringing vegetables, dairy products, and fruits into cities more quickly than previous generations could imagine. Throughout the Victorian era, bread remained one of the most important foods in Britain. Rich or poor, nearly everyone ate it every day. Bakers rose before dawn to prepare thousands of loaves for local communities. White bread was especially prized because it was associated with quality and wealth, while darker breads were often consumed by those with fewer resources. Tea continued to accompany meals whenever possible. By the afternoon, many households looked forward to another cup. The simple ritual of pouring tea, sharing conversation, and pausing from work offered a small moment of comfort in a society that was becoming increasingly fast-paced. As daylight slowly moved across the streets and rooftops of Victorian Britain, kitchens prepared for the most important meal yet to come, the evening dinner that would bring families together once again around the table. As evening approached, Victorian households prepared for the most important meal of the day. Dinner was not simply about eating. It was a daily event that reflected social status, family traditions, and the rhythms of 19th century life. Throughout Britain, the evening meal brought people together after hours of work, school, and household duties. Yet what appeared on the table could vary dramatically depending on wealth and circumstance. In wealthy homes, dinner was often served later in the evening and could include several elaborate courses. Guests and family members gathered in formal dining rooms, illuminated by gas lamps and candlelight. The meal might begin with soup, followed by fish, roasted meats, seasonal vegetables, game birds, and desserts. Servants moved quietly around the table carrying silver trays and carefully prepared dishes. Dining etiquette was extremely important. People were expected to use the correct utensils, maintain proper posture, and follow complex social customs. For the growing middle class, dinner remained an important family occasion, although it was usually less extravagant. Roast beef, mutton, pork, or chicken often served as the centerpiece of the meal when finances allowed. Potatoes were among the most common side dishes and appeared on countless Victorian tables. Cabbage, carrots, turnips, peas, and onions were also widely consumed. These vegetables were filling, affordable, and available throughout much of the year. Gravy and simple sauces helped add flavor to everyday meals. Working-class families faced a different reality. Meat was often expensive and could not always be purchased regularly. Instead, dinners frequently centered around bread, potatoes, soups, stews, and puddings. Stew was especially popular because it allowed cooks to combine small amounts of meat with vegetables and broth, creating a nourishing meal for large families. A pot could simmer for hours over a coal fire, filling small homes with comforting aromas after long days of labor. One food that surprises many people today is the Victorian love of puddings. The word pudding did not always mean a sweet dessert. Some puddings were savory and contained meat, vegetables, or grains. Others were sweet and made with dried fruits, sugar, spices, and suet. Families eagerly anticipated these dishes, particularly during holidays and special occasions. As darkness settled outside and the sounds of the city gradually softened, families lingered around their tables. Conversation, storytelling, and shared meals strengthened family bonds. For many Victorians, regardless of social class, dinner represented a brief moment of warmth and stability in a world that was changing faster than ever before. And as the evening continued, one beloved Victorian tradition was still waiting to begin: the comforting ritual of tea. After dinner had ended and dishes were cleared away, another cherished Victorian tradition began. Afternoon tea is often the famous custom people remember today, but tea in general was woven throughout nearly every part of Victorian life. Whether rich or poor, millions of people looked forward to a warm cup each day. The ritual brought comfort, conversation, and a brief escape from the demands of work and responsibility. Tea had arrived in Britain long before Queen Victoria's reign. But during the 19th century it became more affordable and widely available than ever before. Expanding trade networks carried enormous quantities of tea from distant parts of the British Empire. As prices gradually fell, families from many social classes could enjoy what had once been considered a luxury. By the middle of the Victorian era, tea was no longer simply a beverage. It had become a national habit. In elegant households, afternoon tea developed into a social event. Ladies gathered in drawing rooms decorated with fine furniture, patterned wallpaper, and fresh flowers. Delicate porcelain cups rested on polished tables while trays carried sandwiches, cakes, biscuits, and bread with butter. Conversations drifted from family news to books, fashion, travel, and local events. Soft sunlight filtered through lace curtains as guests enjoyed a peaceful pause between lunch and dinner. Middle-class families embraced many of the same customs, although on a smaller scale. Tea offered a moment of relaxation after a busy day. Children returned from school. Fathers arrived home from offices and shops, and families gathered around the table. Even a simple plate of bread and jam could transform tea time into something special. It was often one of the few moments when the entire household sat together. Working-class families also treasured tea. After long hours in factories, mines, workshops, and docks, a hot cup provided warmth and energy. Strong tea was commonly served with bread, cheese, or leftover food from earlier meals. In crowded industrial neighborhoods, the familiar sight of steam rising from teacups appeared in countless homes every evening. Tea became so important that many workers considered it essential rather than optional. Alongside tea, Victorians enjoyed a surprising variety of sweet treats. Biscuits, sponge cakes, fruit cakes, and buns became increasingly popular as sugar grew more affordable. Bakeries displayed tempting rows of pastries in their windows, filling streets with inviting aromas. For children especially, these treats added excitement to ordinary days. As evening shadows lengthened and lamps began to glow behind windows across Britain, families settled into familiar routines. The simple comfort of tea, shared with loved ones, helped create a sense of calm and belonging. Yet beyond these peaceful moments, the Victorian relationship with food was also shaped by something many modern people rarely think about anymore: the changing seasons. For modern shoppers, fresh fruits and vegetables are available throughout the year, arriving from distant countries within days. Victorians lived very differently. The changing seasons shaped nearly every aspect of their diet. What appeared on the dinner table in summer could be completely different from what families ate during the cold months of winter. Understanding Victorian food means understanding the powerful influence of nature's calendar. During spring, markets slowly came alive with fresh produce after the long winter months. Early vegetables such as peas, lettuce, spinach, and young carrots were eagerly welcomed. Families looked forward to the return of green foods. After months of relying on root vegetables and preserved ingredients, gardeners worked tirelessly to cultivate crops, while city residents visited local markets in search of seasonal delicacies. Summer brought abundance. Market stalls overflowed with berries, cherries, plums, and other fruits. Wealthier households often maintained kitchen gardens where servants grew vegetables, herbs, and fruit trees. Fresh strawberries became especially popular and were often served with cream. Rural families enjoyed access to produce directly from their land, while city dwellers relied on farmers who transported goods into urban centers. Summer was also the season when families began preparing for the future. Preserving food became an essential task. Housewives and cooks spent countless hours making jams, jellies, and preserves. Fruits were bottled in glass jars, allowing their flavors to be enjoyed months later when fresh supplies disappeared. These carefully prepared stores helped households survive the leaner seasons ahead. Autumn was one of the busiest periods of the year. Harvest season filled markets with apples, pears, onions, pumpkins, and root vegetables. Large quantities of food were gathered and stored before winter arrived. Potatoes were particularly important because they could be kept for long periods and provided a reliable source of nutrition. Farmers, laborers, and families all participated in the annual rhythm of gathering and preserving food. Winter presented greater challenges. Fresh produce became scarce, especially for working-class families. Meals depended heavily on stored foods such as potatoes, turnips, carrots, onions, dried peas, and preserved fruits. Salted meats and smoked fish often appeared on tables because they could be stored without spoiling. Soups and stews became especially valuable during cold weather, providing warmth as well as nourishment. Victorian kitchens adapted constantly to these seasonal realities. There were no supermarkets filled with imported produce from around the world. People learned patience. They anticipated the arrival of favorite foods and appreciated them when they finally appeared. Each season brought its own flavors, traditions, and routines. The Victorian era was shaped by one of the greatest transformations in human history. Steam engines powered factories. Railways connected distant towns, and enormous cities grew at astonishing speed. These changes affected where people worked, how they lived, and even what they ate every day. Food that had once been local and seasonal increasingly became part of a much larger and more complex system. Before the Industrial Revolution, many families relied heavily on nearby farms and local markets. Transporting food over long distances was difficult, slow, and expensive. During Queen Victoria's reign, however, railways spread across Britain like a giant web. Suddenly, fresh milk, vegetables, fish, and meat could travel much farther than before. A fish caught on the coast could arrive in a city hundreds of miles away within a day. This would have seemed almost magical to earlier generations. The railway system transformed shopping habits. Market stalls displayed foods that were once unavailable in certain regions. Families gained access to a wider variety of products, while farmers found new customers far from their own communities. Even small towns benefited from improved transportation. Fresh produce arrived more regularly, and shortages became less common in many areas. Industrialization also changed the way food was produced. Large factories began manufacturing items that had traditionally been made by hand. Biscuits, jams, canned goods, and other products could now be produced in enormous quantities. For the growing middle class, these factory-made foods offered convenience and consistency. Attractive packaging and advertising encouraged consumers to try new products that previous generations had never encountered. Canned food became one of the most important innovations. Using sealed metal containers, food could be preserved for long periods without spoiling. This technology expanded food choices and allowed families to store provisions more easily. Explorers, sailors, soldiers, and ordinary households all benefited from these advances. Yet industrialization also created challenges. Rapid urban growth meant millions of people lived in crowded cities where poverty remained widespread. Many working-class families struggled to afford nutritious meals despite improvements in transportation and food production. Cheap bread, potatoes, and tea continued to form the foundation of many diets. Food quality was not always reliable either. Some dishonest sellers added substances to products to increase profits. Milk could be watered down. Bread might contain unexpected additives. These practices eventually led to demands for stronger food, regulations, and inspections. Even with these problems, Victorian food culture was changing rapidly. The dinner table of 1900 looked very different from that of 1837. Railways, factories, and new technologies had quietly reshaped everyday life. If there was one food that united nearly every Victorian household, it was bread. Rich families served it alongside elegant dinners. Working families depended on it for daily survival. Children carried it to school. Laborers packed it for work. And tea tables were rarely complete without it. Bread was not simply a food during the Victorian era. It was the foundation upon which countless meals were built. Most Victorians ate bread every single day, often several times a day. A typical breakfast might include thick slices spread with butter, jam, or dripping. Lunch could consist of bread paired with cheese or cold meat. During tea time, bread appeared once again in sandwiches or alongside cakes. Even dinner often featured a loaf placed at the center of the table. For many families, bread supplied a large portion of their daily calories. Bakers held an important place in Victorian communities. Their work began long before sunrise. While most people slept, bakers mixed dough, tended ovens, and prepared hundreds of loaves for customers. The smell of freshly baked bread drifting through city streets became a familiar part of daily life. Many people purchased bread from local bakeries, while others baked their own loaves at home whenever possible. White bread was especially prized. It was made from finely milled flour and was often viewed as a symbol of quality and prosperity. Wealthier families generally preferred the whitest loaves available. Darker breads, made from less refined flour, were often associated with lower incomes, although they frequently contained more nutrients. Social status could sometimes be reflected simply by the color of the bread on a family's table. Yet bread was not always as pure as consumers expected. During parts of the Victorian era, some dishonest producers added substances to flour in order to increase profits or improve appearance. Public concern about food quality eventually encouraged governments to introduce stricter regulations and inspections. These efforts helped improve standards and protect consumers from unsafe practices. Bread also played an important role during difficult times. When money was scarce, families could often survive on bread, tea, and a few simple additions. It provided comfort, familiarity, and a dependable source of nourishment. In crowded industrial neighborhoods, long lines sometimes formed outside bakeries as residents purchased their daily loaves. Looking back, it is difficult to overstate the importance of bread in Victorian life. It appeared at grand banquets and humble kitchen tables alike. While fashions, technologies, and cities changed dramatically throughout the 19th century, bread remained a constant companion. But alongside this beloved staple, another surprisingly important food was quietly feeding millions of Victorians every day: the humble potato. While bread may have been the foundation of the Victorian diet, the potato was its faithful companion. By the 19th century, potatoes had become one of the most important foods in Britain. They were inexpensive, filling, easy to grow, and versatile enough to appear in countless meals. For millions of Victorians, especially those in working-class households, potatoes were not simply a side dish. They were a daily necessity. A Victorian cook could prepare potatoes in many different ways. They might be boiled and served alongside meat, mashed with butter, added to soups, baked near the fire, or mixed into stews. Even families with very little money could often afford potatoes, making them one of the most reliable sources of nourishment available. Their ability to satisfy hunger made them particularly valuable during difficult economic times. In industrial cities, workers frequently depended on potatoes to sustain them through long hours of physical labor. A simple meal of potatoes and bread could provide enough energy to get through a demanding day in a factory, mine, or dockyard. Families often purchased them in large quantities because they stored well and remained edible for long periods. When kept in cool conditions, potatoes were also important in rural communities. Farmers commonly grew them alongside other crops, and many households maintained small garden plots where their own supply could be cultivated. Children often helped with planting and harvesting, learning agricultural skills from an early age. The annual potato harvest became part of the seasonal rhythm that shaped countryside life. Victorian recipe books reveal just how popular potatoes had become. Some cooks prepared potato cakes, while others created savory pies filled with potatoes and vegetables. Leftover potatoes were rarely wasted. Resourcefulness remained an important virtue, and experienced homemakers knew how to transform even the simplest ingredients into satisfying meals. Despite their popularity, Victorians remembered that dependence on a single crop could be dangerous. Earlier in the century, the devastating potato blight had contributed to widespread suffering in Ireland. This tragedy remained within living memory for many people during Queen Victoria's reign and served as a reminder of how closely food and survival were connected. Yet for most Victorian families, potatoes represented comfort rather than hardship. They appeared at breakfast, lunch, and dinner tables throughout the country. Warm, affordable, and dependable, they earned a permanent place in everyday life. If bread and potatoes formed the backbone of Victorian meals, protein came from another source that revealed enormous differences between rich and poor. The story of Victorian meat tells us more about class and social status than almost any other food on the table. One of the easiest ways to understand Victorian society is to look at what people ate. Food revealed wealth, status, and opportunity more clearly than almost anything else. While bread and potatoes appeared on tables across the country, access to meat varied enormously. For some families, it was an everyday expectation. For others, it was an occasional luxury enjoyed only on special occasions. In wealthy Victorian households, meat formed the centerpiece of many meals. Roast beef was especially admired and became closely associated with British identity. Mutton, pork, lamb, venison, poultry, and game birds also appeared regularly at upper-class tables. Large country estates often supplied their own meat through farming, hunting, and game preserves. Elaborate dinners might feature several different meat dishes, served during a single evening. The growing middle class enjoyed greater access to meat than previous generations. As incomes rose and transportation improved, more families could afford regular portions of beef, pork, or mutton. Sunday roast dinners became a cherished tradition in many homes. Families gathered together around carefully prepared meals that represented both comfort and modest prosperity. For working-class families, however, meat remained far less common. Wages were often limited, and feeding large households required careful budgeting. Many families could only afford small quantities of meat, which were stretched as far as possible. A few pieces might be added to a stew, soup, or pie, where vegetables and potatoes provided most of the bulk. Even a modest amount of meat could flavor an entire meal and make it feel more satisfying. Butchers became important figures within Victorian communities. Their shop windows displayed cuts of beef, pork, lamb, and poultry hanging prominently for customers to inspect. Markets bustled with activity as shoppers compared prices and selected ingredients for upcoming meals. The sight and smell of busy meat markets became familiar features of urban life. Meat pies were especially popular because they combined practicality with flavor. Bakers enclosed meat and gravy within sturdy pastry shells that helped preserve freshness and made transportation easier. Workers could carry pies to factories and workshops, while families enjoyed them as affordable dinners. Fish also provided an alternative source of protein. Thanks to expanding railway networks, fresh fish could reach inland cities more quickly than ever before. Fish and potatoes became a common combination, particularly among working families seeking nutritious meals at reasonable prices. The contrast between rich and poor remained visible at the Victorian dinner table, yet nearly everyone valued meat when it was available. It symbolized prosperity, strength, and comfort. And when Victorians wanted to celebrate a holiday, a birthday, or a special family gathering, they often turned to something sweeter. After hearty dinners of bread, potatoes, vegetables, and meat, many Victorians looked forward to something sweet. The 19th century was an age that truly embraced desserts. Improvements in trade and manufacturing made ingredients, such as sugar, spices, cocoa, and dried fruits, more available than ever before. As a result, Victorian kitchens became famous for producing an astonishing variety of puddings, cakes, tarts, and other treats that brought comfort and pleasure to daily life. One of the most beloved desserts was the pudding. To modern ears, the word may suggest a soft, creamy dessert. But Victorian puddings came in many forms. Some were steamed for hours inside cloth bags or metal molds. Others contained dried fruits, breadcrumbs, suet, spices, and sugar. A rich plum pudding often appeared during Christmas celebrations and became one of the most enduring symbols of Victorian holiday traditions. Fruit played an important role in desserts whenever it was available. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, and berries were transformed into pies, tarts, crumbles, and preserves. Families eagerly anticipated seasonal harvests because fresh fruit brought variety and color to the table. During colder months, preserved fruits and jams helped maintain those flavors long after the growing season had ended. Cakes also became increasingly popular throughout the Victorian era. Sponge cakes, seed cakes, fruit cakes, and tea cakes appeared at family gatherings and social events. Afternoon tea often featured small slices of cake served alongside sandwiches and biscuits. Bakeries displayed tempting selections in their windows, attracting customers with both aroma and appearance. Children especially looked forward to these sweet indulgences. Sugar consumption rose dramatically during the 19th century. What had once been a luxury enjoyed mainly by the wealthy gradually became accessible to much larger portions of the population. Sweetened tea, jams, candies, and baked goods became common features of everyday life. This growing love of sugar helped shape eating habits that would continue well into the 20th century. Wealthier households often enjoyed elaborate desserts prepared by skilled cooks. Decorative molds, colorful jellies, custards, and ornate pastries appeared at formal dinners. Some creations were designed not only to taste good but also to impress guests with their beauty and complexity. Yet even simple households found ways to enjoy sweet treats. A modest pudding shared around the table could bring just as much satisfaction as an extravagant feast. Desserts offered something beyond nourishment, while elegant dining rooms served roasts and puddings. A very different food culture thrived outside on the streets of Victorian Britain. As cities expanded and millions of people worked long hours away from home, street food became an important part of everyday life. Vendors pushed carts through crowded neighborhoods, stood beside busy markets, and called out to passers-by, offering quick, affordable meals for anyone with a few coins in their pocket. For many workers, street food was not merely a convenience, it was often a necessity. Factory shifts could be long, and many laborers lived too far from their workplaces to return home during breaks. Buying food from a street vendor provided a practical solution. These meals were usually simple, filling, and inexpensive enough for ordinary people to afford. One of the most popular street foods was the meat pie. Encased in sturdy pastry, pies were easy to transport and could be eaten without plates or utensils. Vendors sold them warm from carts, making them especially appealing during cold weather. The rich aroma of pastry and gravy drifted through city streets, attracting hungry customers throughout the day. Baked potatoes were another common sight. Vendors roasted them in specially designed ovens and sold them piping hot during the evening. On chilly nights, workers often carried warm potatoes in their hands as they walked home through foggy streets. The potato served not only as food but also as a source of comfort and warmth. Fish became increasingly popular as railway networks improved transportation. Fresh catches from coastal towns could now reach inland cities quickly enough to remain edible. Fried fish shops appeared in many urban neighborhoods, laying the foundation for what would eventually become one of Britain's most famous meals. Street vendors also sold shellfish, particularly oysters, which were surprisingly affordable during much of the Victorian era. Today, oysters are often associated with luxury, but many working-class Victorians viewed them as an inexpensive source of nourishment. Large quantities arrived in city markets each day and were consumed by people from a wide range of social backgrounds. Sweet treats had their place as well. Children eagerly purchased small candies, buns, and pastries whenever they could spare a few pennies. The sight of colorful sweets displayed on carts added a touch of excitement to busy streets, filled with smoke, horses, and crowds. Victorian street food reflected the energy of rapidly growing cities. It was practical, affordable, and deeply connected to the rhythms of urban life. Yet not everyone purchased food from vendors. Behind the doors of countless homes, Victorian kitchens remained busy places where women spent hours preparing meals from scratch using skills passed down through generations. Behind every Victorian meal stood hours of work that most people rarely noticed. Before electric mixers, refrigerators, microwaves, or modern appliances, preparing food required patience, skill, and physical effort. The Victorian kitchen was one of the busiest rooms in the house, and for many women it was the center of daily life. Every loaf of bread, pot of soup, roasted joint of meat, and baked pudding demanded careful attention from beginning to end. In wealthy households, kitchens operated almost like small businesses. Servants rose before sunrise to light coal fires, fetch water, clean cooking equipment, and begin preparing meals. Large houses often employed cooks, kitchen maids, and other servants whose entire day revolved around food preparation. Even a simple breakfast required considerable effort when everything had to be made by hand. Coal stoves dominated Victorian kitchens. These heavy iron ranges produced heat for cooking, baking, and warming water. Managing them required experience. Too much fuel could overheat food, while too little could leave meals undercooked. Cooks constantly adjusted fires throughout the day, learning to judge temperatures through observation rather than modern thermometers. Water presented another challenge. Most households lacked indoor plumbing during much of the Victorian era. Water often had to be carried from pumps, wells, or communal sources. Every pot of tea, bowl of soup, and dishwashing task began with someone physically transporting water into the home. Middle-class women frequently supervised household cooking themselves, even when they employed a small number of servants. Recipe books became increasingly popular during the 19th century, offering guidance on everything from roasting meat to preserving fruit. Successful homemaking was considered an important skill, and many women took pride in providing nourishing meals for their families. Working-class households faced even greater difficulties. Kitchens were often small and crowded. Limited budgets forced families to use ingredients carefully and avoid waste whenever possible. Leftovers were transformed into new meals. Bones became soup stock, and every scrap of food held value. Resourcefulness was often more important than expensive ingredients. Baking day was especially demanding. Mixing dough by hand, kneading bread, and managing oven temperatures required both strength and experience. The aroma of freshly baked loaves rewarded these efforts and filled homes with a sense of comfort that many Victorians associated with family life. Looking back, it is remarkable how much labor stood behind even the simplest meal. Every cup of tea and every slice of bread represented hours of preparation. Yet, despite the hard work, food remained one of the most important sources of comfort in Victorian life. And nowhere was that comfort more evident than during holidays and celebrations, when ordinary meals gave way to some of the most memorable feasts of the entire year. For Victorians, holidays were not only times of celebration, they were also opportunities to enjoy foods that rarely appeared during ordinary weeks. Throughout the year, families looked forward to special occasions when tables became more abundant, recipes more elaborate, and meals more memorable. Whether rich or poor, people often saved their best ingredients and greatest efforts for these treasured moments. Christmas stood above all other holidays when it came to food. By the late Victorian era, many traditions that remain familiar today had become firmly established. Families gathered around decorated homes, exchanged gifts, and prepared festive meals that brought relatives together. The centerpiece of a Christmas dinner was often roast goose, turkey, beef, or another large joint of meat, depending on the family's income and local customs. Vegetables, stuffing, and rich gravies completed the feast. No Victorian Christmas felt complete without plum pudding. Despite its name, the dessert often contained no actual plums. Instead, it was made from dried fruits, breadcrumbs, spices, sugar, and suet. The mixture was carefully prepared, steamed for hours, and sometimes stored for weeks before serving. When brought to the table, it might be decorated with holly and even covered with flaming brandy, creating a dramatic moment that delighted guests. Mince pies were another favorite holiday treat, filled with dried fruits, spices, and sweet ingredients. They reflected the Victorian love of rich flavors and festive baking. The aromas of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves filled kitchens during the Christmas season, creating memories that lasted long after the holiday ended. Birthdays, weddings, and family anniversaries also inspired special meals. Cakes became increasingly important during celebrations. Wealthier households sometimes commissioned elaborate multi-tiered cakes, decorated with intricate icing and ornaments. Even modest families often prepared a simple cake whenever circumstances allowed. Harvest festivals held particular significance in rural communities. After months of labor in fields and gardens, families celebrated successful harvests with shared meals and local gatherings. Seasonal produce appeared in abundance, and communities expressed gratitude for the food that would help sustain them through winter. For children, holidays often meant rare opportunities to enjoy sweets, cakes, and other treats that might not be available during ordinary days. The excitement surrounding these foods became part of the celebration itself. Looking back, Victorian holiday meals reveal something important about human nature. Across social classes and generations, people used food to mark meaningful moments, strengthen family bonds, and create lasting memories. Yet, despite all these methods, Victorian families remained closely connected to the natural rhythms of food. They understood where it came from, how it was preserved, and how quickly it could disappear. As our journey through Victorian kitchens nears its end, one final question remains. What did all these meals, traditions, and daily routines reveal about the people who lived during this remarkable age? Keeping food fresh is something most people rarely think about today. Refrigerators quietly preserve milk, meat, vegetables, and leftovers with little effort. Victorians lived in a very different world. Throughout most of the 19th century, families had to rely on skill, experience, and traditional preservation methods to prevent food from spoiling. The challenge affected every household. From grand estates to crowded city apartments, fresh food was highly valued because it could not always be stored for long periods. Milk was especially troublesome. Without refrigeration, it spoiled quickly, particularly during warm weather. Many families purchased milk daily from local suppliers or kept their own cows whenever possible. In cities, milk vendors made regular rounds through neighborhoods, delivering fresh supplies before they could sour. Meat presented another challenge. Before modern cooling systems, it needed to be consumed relatively quickly or preserved through other methods. Salting became one of the most common solutions. Large quantities of salt drew moisture from meat and slowed spoilage. Salted beef, pork, and fish could be stored for extended periods and became staples in many Victorian households. Smoking offered another effective preservation technique. Meat and fish were exposed to smoke from slow-burning wood fires, which helped protect them while adding distinctive flavors. Smoked hams and fish remained popular throughout the Victorian era and could often be found hanging in kitchens, markets, and food shops. Fruits and vegetables required their own preservation methods. Drying removed moisture and extended shelf life, making it possible to enjoy certain foods long after harvest season ended. Raisins, currants, and dried apples appeared in many Victorian recipes. Housewives also prepared jams, jellies, and preserves by combining fruit with sugar. Stored in sealed jars, these sweet creations could last for months and brought a taste of summer into the middle of winter. Root vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, onions, and turnips were easier to store. They were often kept in cool cellars, sheds, or storage pits, where temperatures remained relatively stable. These humble vegetables helped sustain families throughout colder months when fresh produce became scarce. The invention of canning gradually transformed food preservation during the Victorian era. Sealed metal containers allowed food to remain edible for much longer periods. What began as a technological innovation slowly became a practical part of everyday life. Families gained new options. Explorers carried provisions across great distances, and food supplies became more reliable than ever before. Yet despite all these methods, Victorian families remained closely connected to the natural rhythms of food. They understood where it came from, how it was preserved, and how quickly it could disappear. As our journey through Victorian kitchens nears its end, one final question remains. What did all these meals, traditions, and daily routines reveal about the people who lived during this remarkable age? As our gentle journey through Victorian kitchens comes to an end, it is worth pausing to reflect on what food meant to the people of this remarkable age. Throughout the 19th century, Britain changed at an extraordinary pace. Railways crossed the countryside. Factories transformed cities, and new inventions reshaped everyday life. Yet despite all these changes, food remained one of the most important parts of daily existence. Every meal told a story about family, work, tradition, and survival. The Victorian table reflected both progress and hardship. Wealthy families enjoyed elaborate dinners, served by servants in elegant homes. Working families often relied on bread, potatoes, tea, and simple stews to feed large households on limited incomes. Yet across these differences, people shared many of the same hopes and routines. Parents worked to provide meals for their children. Families gathered together whenever possible. Special foods marked holidays, celebrations, and milestones that would be remembered for years. Victorians understood something that remains true today. Food was never only about nutrition. A loaf of bread, fresh from the oven, brought comfort. A cup of tea offered a moment of peace after a difficult day. A Christmas pudding connected generations through shared traditions. Even the simplest meal could create memories that lasted a lifetime. Looking back, many Victorian foods seem humble by modern standards. There were no refrigerators filled with international products, no online deliveries, and no supermarkets overflowing with endless choices. Instead, people depended on the seasons, local markets, family recipes, and careful planning. They wasted little, preserved what they could, and appreciated foods that were available only at certain times of year. Perhaps that is one reason Victorian food history feels so fascinating today. It reminds us of a slower world where meals required effort, patience, and skill. Behind every loaf, pie, pudding, and pot of tea stood countless hours of labor. Yet those efforts helped create homes filled with warmth, familiarity, and a sense of belonging. As the evening settles outside and the last embers glow softly in the hearth, we leave the Victorian dining table behind. The dishes have been cleared away, the teacups emptied, and the kitchen fires are slowly fading. But the stories remain. They remind us that history is not only found in great events and famous names. It also lives in everyday moments, shared meals, and ordinary people whose lives shaped the world we know today. Thank you for spending this cozy evening exploring what Victorians ate every day. If you enjoyed this journey through the past, be sure to subscribe and join us again here by the fireplace, where the stories of the Victorian era are always waiting to be told. Good night.